Pastor Chris.
Pastor Josh.
That's me. Pastor Chris, you spent a little time down yonder, down in the south. I spent a little time down, and we're not talking about like Portage if you're in central
No.
Wisconsin. I'm talking about Kentucky, Tennessee. Chris, I love country music.
I don't, Josh.
Okay, good to know.
You're wrong.
It's a podcast not about you though. So if you find my wife and I sitting on our porch, we are either listening to worship music or country music. I hate the theology of country music. I love the twang. I hate some of the things that they say. And one theme you'll hear in country music is this theme of freedom. I can think of a Drake White song called "Free."
Who's Drake White?
Drake White, you should listen to him.
The country
On your way
musician?
home? Yeah. I think of Zach Brown has a song called "Free." I think of just all of these different ideas of what it is to be free. And a lot of times in country music, it has to do with being on a rural road or being near the water, my
Your dog.
toes in the water, my behind in the sand, if you're familiar with the song.
I'm not.
But there's this idea of and honestly, man, they are fun songs to listen to. Because there's a little bit of me that goes, man, when I was in the Bahamas, I did feel a little bit freer. And you might have
I'll
felt,
take your word for it, Josh.
you might have felt freer because I was out of town.
I missed you.
But this idea, Chris, of freedom, I think, is one that sparks the human imagination. We want to be free, whether it's American liberty type of freedom, whether it's sexual freedom, whether it's, I don't know, some people want mental freedom. Like they just battle their thoughts all the time and they just wish they could be free mentally. Or whether it's country music freedom where you just want a long weekend. This idea of freedom comes up a lot, and it's one that comes up in Rousseau. Here's a quote that we're just going to discuss briefly here. Rousseau says, "Man is born free, and yet everywhere is in chains." And so when we discuss this in light of Rousseau's other philosophy about man being kind of pure inwardly, and he is corrupted by people outside of himself, it makes sense that Rousseau would say, at birth, you're the most pure. You're born free. And then all of your life, you are in chains. Can you kind of reflect on Rousseau's view of freedom and maybe even how that bleeds into our thoughts about freedom?
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that he would disagree with me that one of the chains is country music, in fact. So, one of the things that we do find is problematic in our
One of
culture.
the corrupting influences.
One of the corrupting influences. Listen to more 90s rock.
Oh, man, I have so many friends who are musicians in this church that if you're listening to this podcast, you just won them over.
Good. Oh, boy. But what would Rousseau say about this, and how would we respond? You know, this idea of the pure individual, this idea of the uncorrupted individual, it ultimately, it then shows itself with that kind of a quote that says, we love freedom, we love liberty, so let's throw off the chains that bind us. And the chains that bind us would be anything that prevents us from becoming the most authentic version of who we feel ourselves at any given time. So I think that we can see, you know, I'll say this, I'll be really clear about this, that abortion is evil, it's wicked, it's heinous, it's despicable, and it is murder. And yet you see individuals say that their perspective on freedom exists in what they call reproductive rights. Their ability to do what they feel like at any given time, if it hampers their ability, and this is the argument, generally speaking, the argument, and it's the case based on abortion statistics, that there are very few abortions that take place because there is a medical need, like an ectopic pregnancy, which are genuine medical conditions. The vast majority of abortions take place because they're inconvenient. A child welcoming into a family or a woman's life is inconvenient. And so the child, of all the most heinous things in the entire world, see the life of another human being as a chain that prevents you from becoming who you feel you should be, whether it's economically, you want to be economically free, you know, so you don't want to have to support another mouth to feed. You want to have career freedom. You want to be able to rise in your chosen career, however high you want. And so I think just in that case alone, you see everybody demanding in it. What's strange and ironic is that you see competing voices with the same individuals who may say, my body, my choice, but make sure everybody else around me has a COVID vaccine. So where's the consistency? What's consistency with freedom here? And the freedom here is don't cramp my style. Don't get in the way of my ability to be me. And that all is rooted in Rousseau's thought that I'm free unless you make me not.
Yeah, and so we want to be able to, wow, Chris, we want to be able to discuss Rousseau's thoughts because they can lead to something as
Right.
profoundly immoral as taking the life of a child.
Yep.
We've also discussed on previous podcasts that this idea of freedom can lead to something as harmful as divorce. That if my spouse is not currently providing me happiness, then they become a chain.
Talk about Rousseau in that
And-
regard, Josh.
I mean,
His own personal life.
we mentioned this in an earlier episode that Rousseau threw off the chains of his 5 children to orphanages in a time where orphanages were not as safe and
It was Oliver Twist world.
yeah, and so you see, I think what's interesting about you using the topic of abortion immediately, it's striking. It also shows us that how we define what a chain is just subjective to what our freedom
Correct.
is supposed to be. So if my freedom is to be happy, then my wife could be a chain. If my freedom is to be financially free, my child could be a chain. If my freedom is to pursue whatever morality I deem fit, my church could be a chain.
Right.
If my freedom is to determine what I am to do with my body, then the Bible becomes a chain. But what we see in all of those examples is that if I want to do something, I feel it's right, and something would restrict me from doing that, then that's a chain. Chris, children and wives are chains in the sense that they restrict,
Right.
just as husbands and children are chains, just as any human relationship is a...
Parents are chains.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think about, I sat down with my wife yesterday morning, and I said, I would like to do this weekend, this weekend, and this weekend. I have a higher capacity for relational involvement. I don't get tired as easily. I don't get stressed as easily. So I could very well stack my weekend from Friday morning to Sunday night and go, whew, good weekend.
Right. Yep.
My wife needs more rest, needs more time alone with just me, her, and my son. And so she essentially helped me see that I was being pretty selfish, and I was thinking, here's what is good for me, here's what I could
Sure.
do. And so eventually the decision was I should probably pick 2 of the 3 things because that's what's best for my family. Is that a restriction? Yes.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it is a chain that I need to liberate myself from. It means that for the good of a group that I'm in, certain restrictions need to be adopted. And so where Rousseau has this kind of, he is a romantic, he has this romantic ideal of freedom, is he leads you to believe that anything that restricts you is bad. And that's so problematic because it's going to lead us, I think about like parent-child relationships. If I'm kind of observing socially, 30, 40 years ago, if you really hated your parents, then you probably progress to a point where you only show up to the family stuff when you have to.
Right.
But they're still your parents.
Yep.
Like you still have to do some certain things as part of the family. Now, if you really hate your parents, you just don't talk to them
Never seen it.
because you can throw off the chain. And so these ideas that Rousseau presents, they really impact the different decisions that we make. And so, Chris, how does this idea of the need to be free in what I want to do and the idea of chains keeping me from that, how does that impact those in the church?
You know what, Josh? As pastors of the same church, we are in elder meetings where we discuss all kinds of different things that come across. What affects your campus in Wausau, my campus in Stevens Point. We have discussions about things that arise, individuals who might be straying from a love for Jesus and their actions and decisions and so forth. And I think the consistent pattern that I see time and time and time and time and time and time again is your, I guess I'll just kind of take that individual's perspective. Your leadership and your teaching on the matter restrict my ability to do what I believe God wants me to do. And this is where people who have enough acquaintance with the Bible and with the church can be just as guilty of doing this very thing. We just baptize it in spiritual language. I will say that, without just even betraying my own theology on the matter, like when people will say the words, God told me, I just brace myself. Because unless you're quoting from the 66 books of the Bible, you can't be sure that God has told you anything. But typically, God told me will be prefatory remarks to something that is going to be very otherwise unacceptable, most likely, if you were to present it to church leadership as a whole, to other believers that you might be talking to. So when you say God told me, you're using a trump card that can't be questioned because you in your own private experience have said, yes, this is what God wants me to do. And doesn't God want what's best for me? And so we baptize it in spiritual language. And so instead of saying something as basic and blunt as, yeah, I want to do this because it's going to make me happy. It's, I want to do this, but I really believe God told me this is what I should be doing. And we can scratch our heads as pastors and think like, no, he didn't tell you that because he didn't tell us that in the Bible altogether. He certainly hasn't told us that as the leaders responsible for your care. And yet time and time again, people will come to the table in situations where there's like some really clear problems that when we look at things from a biblical perspective, be like, yeah, this is not healthy behavior. We'll come to them and they'll say, well, I just, God told me, or I just don't feel like, and it will be then followed up with, and now we are leaving, throwing the chains off of the individual because we are violating their ability to be who God has called them to be. And it's so insanely subversive of what God's actual purpose is. Because, we've talked about corporate, individual dimensions or whatever. I mean, man, God calls us to grow together in community. And that involves at times accepting the chains of relationships with other people with whom you disagree and are forced to love.
Yeah.
And the chains from other people who say things that you might disagree with.
And this is where a Christian worldview and a non-Christian worldview collide because, so you and I as pastors need to be very careful not to put unbiblical chains.
Right.
I mean, I think about like the Baptist discourse on Harry Potter in the 90s. And
Sure.
Are we going to chain, you and I would call it binding the conscience as pastors.
Yep.
Are we going to chain someone to not do a thing, whether it be alcohol or Harry Potter or getting a tattoo, or there's some different discourses within Christianity. And I think now it would still be like media consumption. How are we going to biblically provide restrictions? And that's a danger for you and I to not just impose our personal beliefs as a chain.
Like country music.
I'm not going to impose country music on anyone, though I do think it'll set you free. But like you're saying, at the same time, God has made us, I think if Hebrews 3 says, exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you are hardened by sin's deceitfulness. So the biblical picture of humanity is that you and I, Chris, as human beings, are going to be deceived by sin, and we need other people to be guarding us from that, because there will be many, many, many times where we are so wrong about what we should pursue with our freedom. And we're often so wrong about freedom as this ultimate goal. I mean, Christian liberty becomes my excuse for watching what I want, using my money how I want, spending my time as I want. The passage we don't often like to quote is Jesus saying, if you want to be my follower, then take up your cross and deny yourself. And we want to ask, why does that hurt us so much? It's because we've been born into a society birthed by Rousseau that says you were born free and your goal is to regain your freedom.
Deny yourself. I mean, good grief. That's not even a possibility, right?
So then why, Chris? Why would we ever deny ourselves if the dominant zeitgeist, spirit of the age, the dominant zeitgeist is saying you have to be free? Why would we ever adopt restrictions from a God who tells us there are things we can't do?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been influenced by John Piper, former pastor in Minneapolis, and now serving in the Bethlehem College and Seminary, and heavily influenced by him for a couple decades now. And he constantly talks about the idea of a Christian hedonist. I think that's a perfect response for somebody when somebody says, why would I ever want to deny myself? And it's funny because Jesus even responds in similar terms to some of the apostles when they're asking him questions about, like, man, I've left all this stuff. I've left all this stuff. What am I going to get? What am I going to get? What am I going to get, Jesus? And it's you can find superior satisfaction, the superior pleasure in the things God intended to satisfy you. And so when you talk to somebody about denying themselves, you're not saying deny yourself and be miserable. It's deny yourself and find lasting joy. That's what the call is. And so you look at Rousseau and it's like, you've never tasted what it is to be actually free. Because, when you look at the Apostle John, he says that we know we've come to know God, to love God, if we obey his commandments. And then he follows it by saying, and his commandments are not burdensome. So it's saying, you know what? If you've been set free, you will accept certain chains that allow you to experience genuine freedom. And it might sound completely nonsensical to somebody who is not a follower of Jesus. I grant that. I mean, before I really knew Jesus, my perspective and worldview was completely in the like, oh, just don't judge people. Don't judge people. But there is a superior pleasure to be found in being. Can
I tell you something that blew my mind, Chris?
Please do it. Yeah.
This was when I just got married. And if you're watching with a young kid, maybe one, let us know if the young kid has any clue what we're talking about. Two, maybe kind of filter this next part out. I had an older couple, probably in their 60s, right when I got married, tell me that they were having the best physical intimacy of their life. Been married to each other for over 35 years, and I'm like, okay, I've been told that the best physical intimacy is to be had by people who are young and in shape and pursuing whoever they want. And now I have an older, not out of shape, but your body starts to break down a little bit. And they're telling me they got the best physical intimacy that they've ever had because they've restricted themselves to one person over the course of 35 years, so much so that God's design for sex is that they would be souls mingled together and it would be so much more than physical. And so I think in a culture that the chains are often sexual, as in what you can't do with your body, you have this mind-blowing realization that people are saying, because I've restricted myself to one person, because I've given my life to that one person, the pleasure is greater. And that's where we have to appeal to wisdom outside of us, appeal to wisdom older than us, because that in a culture that is very, is it Rousseauian? I've been trying to very Rousseau focused of man is born free and everywhere in chains. This idea of adopting a chain to become free, it's bonkers. And yet, Jesus desires to set us free, doesn't he? I mean, 1 Corinthians, whom the Son sets free is free indeed. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. The difference in the biblical view of freedom and the Rousseau view of freedom is that for you to be free, Chris, for me to be free, Christ has to set us free from ourselves. And I think an honest observer who has spent 10 or 15 years pursuing pleasure would be able to say, I haven't found it in any lasting measure. Maybe I even am worse off now. If that pleasure has been physical, maybe I've harmed myself. I don't have the freedom that I've long desired because God has told us that the only way to find freedom is for Christ to set me free from myself, set me free from my evil individual passions, set me free from my selfishness, set me free from my temptations to sin, set me free from a sinful nature that I can't defeat on my own, set me free from a world of sin and death. Death, the great enemy. Christ sets me free. And so you might adopt Rousseau's statement to say, man is born in chains, born with original sin from Adam, born in a world of sin and death and decay, born in societies that do inflict trauma on one another. Man is born in chains, but Christ will set you free. And so let's flip that one on its head and proclaim that if you want freedom, Christ will set you free. I think it's a great way to end today. Thanks for being part of these discussions. We hope they are beneficial to you and to your soul.